Vista, a podcast on energy issues. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we will chat with energy experts from all around the world. They will tell us about their passion, inspiration, and aspiration. It's December 3, 2018, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. We will hear about Lisa Viscidi. Lisa is currently Program Director Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries at the Dialogue, which is a think tank on the Americas based in Washington, D.C. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Leslie.
Thank you very much for joining us. And thanks also for taking a leap of faith in joining our first episodes. You're among our first guests, and thank you for trusting me.
Thank you. It's an honor. Pleasure to be speaking with you.
Thanks. So we're going to hear about Venezuela today. You're an expert on all things energy and Latin America, but we decided to focus mostly on Venezuela because a lot of things are happening in the country. And I think it's going to be interesting to hear about the outlook for 2019. So let me start by asking you, since Nicolas Maduro was reelected in May, the country's economy is not doing better. It's collapsing. There is also a humanitarian tragedy. And on top of that, oil exports are shrinking. Why exactly are we still, like the world and the oil industry, still caring so much about Venezuela, and especially the US government?
Well, I mean, I think the situation in Venezuela just keeps getting worse and worse. And people keep speculating about when it's going to hit bottom, and it still doesn't happen. So, whether you're talking about the industry and oil production, or whether you're talking about the economy, the humanitarian situation, things just continue to get worse and worse. So, I mean, just as an example, in terms of oil production, currently, according to secondary sources, we don't have reliable data directly from Venezuela, but production is around 1.17 million barrels a day as of this fall. You compare that to just 1 year earlier, in October 2017, it was 1.86 million barrels a day. So that's a 37% drop just over the course of 1 year. And that's from when Maduro took power in 2013, production was probably around 2.8 million barrels a day. So we're talking about a loss of about 1.5 million barrels a day or more over the course of his presidency. And production every month, it just continues to decline. Exports obviously are down as a result. Even exports to the U.S. are much lower than they used to be, and that's Venezuela's key source of cash. So because Venezuela is so dependent on the oil industry, losing this production and this export revenue also hits the economy really hard and is really the result of the humanitarian crisis as well.
So you mentioned the U.S. as a buyer of Venezuelan oil. Where else? Because I saw today, I think the Turkish President Erdogan is visiting Venezuela. Is it mostly to entertain like the oil relationship and bilateral relations? Where else is key in the bilateral trade relation with Venezuela?
Well, the other two big buyers after the U.S. have always been China and India. So China has a lot of oil for loan deals with Venezuela, and so they have sort of through bilateral negotiations created this relationship where China gives loans to Venezuela, Venezuela exports its oil, and a portion of it is used to pay back the loan. So that means that there's always going to be a lot of oil going to China. But India is also an important buyer. It's one of the few countries in the world that has a large refining complex that can process heavy crude. So that means India has always been an important source for receiving cash directly, because rather than just using it to pay off a loan, Venezuela is actually receiving cash from India. But I don't think the issue for Venezuela right now is finding new markets for its oil. The U.S. is taking all of the oil that Venezuela can send to it. The problem is their production is down so much that they don't have enough oil to export, and it's not a shortage of buyers, it's really a shortage of oil to export. That's their problem.
And so how fast are their exports going to decline?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't have, my own projection, but I would say that things are going to continue to go downhill. And we have a couple of different issues going on that we can look at to see, how much worse will things get. I think one of the big questions is what's going to happen with debt. Venezuela, both PDVSA, the state oil company, and the government itself have been selectively defaulting. So there was a case, there have been several bonds that they've defaulted on, and there have been cases where creditors have started to seize assets. So there was a very important case where Conoco was able to make a claim to some of PDVSA's processing and storage facilities in the Caribbean. Venezuela owes Conoco and Exxon money from arbitration cases that have been in the process for years since their assets were expropriated under Chavez in 2007. And so Conoco and Exxon have been going after this money for a long time, and they actually had a ruling that said that they could claim the assets that Venezuela had in the Caribbean. So I think this was really important because it set a precedent to say, well, PDVSA and Venezuela are continuously defaulting on their bonds, on their payments that they owe through arbitration cases, and we're seeing that creditors are able to start to seize their assets. If somehow creditors were even able to seize shipments of oil, that would be something that would really make the situation a lot worse because they're obviously dependent on the crude oil exports, but they're also dependent on revenues coming from Citgo, their U.S. refinery, which is their most important asset abroad, and has 700,000 barrel a day refining capacity, and which is their inroad into the U.S. market, their most important market. So I think one thing to look at is, what will happen with these defaults? What will happen with creditors seizing their assets? That could be a signal to how much worse things are going to get.
Yeah. So do you see potentially a collapse of the government in 2019 driven by the energy crisis, or more is needed?
Well, despite all this, I don't think so. I mean, it's hard to say exactly when the tipping point will be and what would lead to the fall of Maduro. But I think a lot of people are asking, how could this situation have gone on for so long? But I think what really people didn't calculate looking at Venezuela is the level of repression that the government would be capable of. I mean, they have a system where they have like an ID card. It's actually a very technologically sophisticated system, and they've gotten some technology from China and some advice from the Cuban government, and they use it to control rations of food, more recently of gasoline, and so that's been one tool to keep
medicines also.
I think medicine, people are just going to the hospital and they're just finding that there isn't medicine available. So it's mostly used as a ration for food. More recently, they also said gasoline was going to be rationed through the system. And so that's one way, if there's any sign that you're protesting, they can take away your food. And there's also been really good intelligence in the military to make sure that a military coup isn't possible, and they've actually snuffed out some plots against Maduro and stopped them before they happened. And so I think also the migration wave, there's around well over 1 million people have left Venezuela. 1 million alone have gone to Colombia, and so that's also a sort of an escape valve for people. And so I think because of all this, they've been able to continue with this system of repression, and despite all the economic problems and humanitarian crisis, there's really right now there's just sort of no mechanism or no way to overthrow Maduro. And so, it'd be hard to say, 2019 is the year when he's going to fall. I don't think that we can really say that.
Yeah, and even if there was a change of government, could PDVSA recover, or it's such in a bad shape that the company is
doomed? A very long time. I mean, I think first of all, if Maduro falls, who comes next? Is it somebody that's really going to change things and have a policy for the industry that's really going to turn things around? That's unclear in any case. But even if, let's say, you had somebody who had a totally different approach and tried to go back to a more kind of rational system for energy policy, it would take a long time to recover. A lot of what people say is that they've really ruined some of the wells so that you couldn't just sort of go back and get the oil pumping again. A lot of the wells have collapsed to a degree there where they couldn't recover, especially I think in the more mature fields where they needed to do enhanced oil recovery. Those fields have really been kind of destroyed. I think in the Orinoco, the unconventional oil, there's still huge potential there, and that could be built up, but you'd have to build a lot of infrastructure. You'd have to build upgraders to process the crude. It's something that would take several years.
And they would need foreign investors to come back and to regain confidence in the country, which
that would be required. And that's why I don't think under this government there's any chance of getting foreign investment increasing. Everybody's trying to get out, really, sell the assets that they have. And so it would also, I think you could quickly, with the new president, you could quickly send a signal of investor confidence that people would respond to quickly. But getting production back up again would take a couple of years.
Okay. So I remember also, like back in 2008, when I was attending LNG conferences, energy conferences, the industry talking about vast gas reserves and plans for liquefaction projects, export projects out of Venezuela. Do you think Venezuela will ever monetize its vast gas reserves, or that will remain underground forever?
I think under this government, I don't see the gas reserves really getting developed either. There have been a couple of attempts to make conditions for investment more favorable to gas. One of the issues is that there's a very heavy subsidy for electricity, which means that you can't sell gas at a rate that you would even make back your investment. And you have to favor the domestic market, so you have to make sure you supply the domestic market. There have been some attempts to reform the tariff structure to make it a bit more attractive, but I think as long as you have this very uncertain and complicated political environment, on top of that, Venezuela's become a country that companies don't really want to be associated with and don't want to be working in. So I don't think that there would be development of the gas reserves anytime soon, but of course the potential is still there. Yeah. And then, what you're talking about was back when the U.S. was still expected to be a major importer.
Correct.
There weren't that many big projects. Now,
and then Japanese companies were also very interested in Venezuela gas for diversification purposes.
Projects, and one of the biggest buyers is now one of the biggest sellers.
Right.
So I also think that the conditions at this time for a new project that's expensive are not as favorable as they were then.
So the only way might be only through Trinidad if the companies manage to get a deal, and also the governments if they agree on cross-border developments and unitization of several fields, which is also a remote option. Yeah.
The deal with Trinidad, because Trinidad has declining production and declining reserves, and so they could use Venezuelan gas to export as LNG from their facilities if they can come to an agreement. And there's a good relationship between Venezuela and Trinidad, but I still think working out the economics of it is very complicated.
Yeah, especially in a world where there is an abundance of gas, and the big challenge is to monetize it in a competitive way. Good. Well, so let's move to our second section. Well, before that, let me ask you, because we're talking about oil and gas, but what about renewables? Is it a way out potentially for the economy in Venezuela?
I think Venezuela, of all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Venezuela is probably thinking the least about renewables and climate change. I mean, I think that they're just, dealing with the day-to-day crisis, and they're still very focused on how to develop the oil sector. I think Chavez came into power saying Venezuela needs to diversify more. We've got to diversify our economy away from oil. Yeah. And Venezuela actually got more concentrated under his government and more dependent on oil. So I don't think anything's happening in terms of renewables. They do have a large dependence on hydro, but that's always been the case. And I think will continue to be, but there's not really much innovation going on. And I think, other things could make it even more difficult. So, the possibility of U.S. sanctions, I think, is still on the table.
You mean new sanctions?
I mean, I think it's a possibility. It's definitely, I think the U.S. government has waited to see what the impact of the existing sanctions have been. And basically, during 3 rounds of sanctions under the Trump administration, the U.S. government restricted the ability of the Venezuelan government, including PDVSA, to take on new loans and to sell its public assets like Citgo. And so I think right now the administration is concerned that they could worsen the humanitarian crisis, and also that they would actually put further upward pressure on oil prices as a result of further sanctions against Venezuela. So it seems like a bit of a risky move that could cause both a domestic negative response, from consumers as well as an international backlash. But at the same time, I think they're still considering, what could be done, what more could be done to put pressure on Maduro. And so, further sanctions would also make it more difficult to invest in any
alternative
sector of the economy, in renewables, in any sector of the economy for Venezuela.
Yeah, good. Okay, so let's move now to our next section, which is your professional trajectory. So Lisa, you are a specialist in energy issues, and you're also a specialist in the region, Latin America, the Americas. So how did you manage to combine both, and was it a plan from the start?
Well, I actually started my career focusing on Latin America. That was my first sort of area of interest. In undergrad, I had studied Latin American history, and then I lived in Guatemala after college. And then I got a master's degree in Latin American studies with a focus on economic development and political science. So I always had this focus on the region and interest in the region. And then I just happened to apply for a job after grad school at Energy Intelligence Group.
Where we both met, by the way.
We both worked together in New York. And, they said, well, you know the region, you speak Spanish and Portuguese, you have experience writing and reporting, so, you'll learn energy on the job. And I did, and I found it a really fascinating way of understanding the region. And I think especially what I focus on a lot now is how do political developments affect energy policy, affect investment conditions. And so I think understanding the political dynamics of the region, whether it's the energy reform in Mexico or discussions about resource nationalism in Venezuela and Brazil, the politics really has a big impact on energy.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, good. And what about the languages? So you're speaking Portuguese, Spanish, and I think I may remember correctly that you managed to have Energy Intelligence paying you for Portuguese classes. How? I mean, was it helpful for you? Yeah, but was it helpful for you to use those language and for the job and for interviewing people, for networking? Like how big was it for you and helpful to speak those two languages?
I think it was really important because I was interviewing sources. I wrote an article. I wrote basically 4 articles a week, almost every day I wrote an article, and every day I had to get on the phone and call all my sources throughout Latin America and interview them. And then I also traveled to the region. I went to conferences. I conducted interviews. So it was really important and continues to be important. Now I also do a lot of work, organizing meetings and things at conferences with people in the region. So it's essential to be able to speak and write, and particularly in Spanish, but also in Portuguese.
Yeah, definitely. Well, same for me. I'm using some French whenever I can. Good. So let's turn now to your personal kind of life and how you combine it with your work. I talked to many different women in the energy sector, and the word that comes up the most is the word flexibility. Do you agree that that for you to make it work, family and your professional trajectory, you need this kind of flexibility? And were you able to negotiate some kind of latitude with your workplace and make it work?
Yes, I think definitely flexibility is probably the most important thing. And my work is I sort of set my own agenda, set my own priorities, and having flexibility is really important, and I sort of work around the schedule of home life, when I have to pick my son up, when I have to drop him off, and then I can always work later in the night if something needs to get done. But I also try to be really efficient with my time instead of spending more hours at the office. Spend them as efficiently as possible so that I'm getting the same amount of work done in a shorter period of time.
Yeah.
And I think nowadays with more and more jobs are measured on overall performance, not on the hours that you're at the office. So at the end of the day, if you're delivering, it doesn't really matter, when you're in the office or exactly what your schedule is. You're just measured on your performance at the end of the year.
Yeah. Is there a downside to actually spending less time in the office? I mean, I feel the same as you regarding productivity and being efficient. But like for many women, they try to combine both. Sometimes it means having a remote desk and working from home, but spending less face time with work colleagues, maybe at the expense of promotion or navigating the internal politics. Have you ever felt that way?
Yes, I think spending time at the office, spending time with your colleagues is very important. And even just for your own learning, I mean, I think every job that I've had, I've learned so much from my colleagues. And all my past jobs were places that were focused on energy issues, where I was the Latin America specialist. And here at the Dialogue, for the first time, it's a place focused on Latin America where I'm the energy specialist.
Right.
And either way, I've learned so much. That's how I learned about the industry, was through my colleagues at prior work, and that's how I stay on top of everything that's going on in the region, is because of my colleagues. So definitely it's important to make time to talk and interact with your colleagues. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I have one thing that I remember when we were one cubicle away at Energy Intelligence, is that you were very organized, including for your business cards. And are you still filing all of them in an Excel table?
Yes, although I have to admit that I don't put the information in myself anymore. I do have a very carefully curated list of contacts, which is extremely important for my work.
Yeah, definitely. Good. Well, Lisa, it was great to have you on. And I hope I'll have you back in 1 year from now. No, we'll have an update on Venezuela by then, I'm sure.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was great speaking.
Thanks. That concludes our Energy Vista podcast, which was recorded on December 3, 2018. Our theme music is provided by Music Screen, licensed under Creative Commons. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.